These are the notes for Key Concept 2, and Key Concept 2 begins with a discussion of European competition for North American resources. That's Key Concept 2.1.I.A. And as a part of this first slide, we're going to talk about how Europeans developed a variety of colonization and immigration patterns. The Spanish, for example, migrated to the southwest from Mexico, where they had come from Hispaniola, and from Florida from Hispaniola. The British to the Atlantic coast, going from the Carolinas to New York State. The French from the Great Lakes region around what's the modern-day Midwestern United States, all the way up to Canada, to New York, and the Dutch to New York State. And in these areas, the European immigrants competed with various Native American groups for resources, one of those Native American groups being the Iroquois Confederacy. The Spanish, French, Dutch, and British colonizers had different economic and imperial goals involving land and labor that shaped the social and political development of their colonies. The Spanish, for example, were motivated economically, gold, and religiously, by wanting to spread Christianity. They intermarried with the Native Americans they found in Mexico and here in America. The French were motivated economically. They traded with, lived among, and worked for various Native American groups in New York and the Great Lakes region, and they intermarried as well. The Dutch controlled trade around New York City and upstate New York. The British came to create a world apart, and with few exceptions did not intermarry. The British also went to war on a number of occasions against various Native American groups to spread the boundaries of the British Empire westward. Spanish development of the encomienda system essentially enslaved Native American populations, converted them to Christianity, and incorporated them into the Spanish Empire. The encomienda system, which was established in 1512, essentially enslaved Native American populations. Conquistadors, who recruited and financed their own expeditions with the help of investors who expected shares of the plunder, were granted a number of Indians from whom labor was extracted. Hernando Cortez, for example, received tribute from 23,000 families, the entire population of Mexico's Oaxaca Valley. The encomienda system was the answer to the fundamental question, how do we get all of this gold and silver out of the earth? Between 1500 and 1650, the Spanish shipped from America to Europe about 181 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver, reversing a trade imbalance with Asia, enabling the purchase of unprecedented quantities of Far Eastern spices and cloth, and setting off a wave of piracy, the likes of which the world had not seen. The Spanish castas system created a societal hierarchy to rank groups within a society that, because of intermarriage and the importation of enslaved Africans, was too complex for binary definitions, such as Spanish or Indian, conqueror or conquered. The castas system designation, included on baptismal records, impacted every aspect of life, from a group's right to reach the upper levels of society and become the aristocracy, who were awarded government jobs, or were prohibited by law from many professions, and whose testimony in court was less valued. French and Dutch colonialism in the northern latitudes of North America relied on trade alliances and intermarriage with Native Americans to build the trade dependency to acquire furs for export to Europe. Neither the French nor the Dutch were conquering forces like Spain, but competed as new tribes from positions of weakness, hoping to create mutuality of dependency. As Indians became dependent upon European metals, cloth, and alcohol, the traders and their empires became hostage to Indian demand. Because a cutoff of trade increasingly threatened the Indians with hunger and destitution, they considered it an act of war. Needing Indians as allies and hunters, the northern traders could not afford them as enemies. Rather than risk a breakdown in trade, the traders grudgingly accepted Indian trade protocols, restrained their prices, and cultivated alliances. Entangled in alliances with Indians, European traders often felt compelled to assist native wars that complicated and slowed their pursuit of profit. From the Indian perspective, the French came, in the words of historian Alan Greer, not as conquering invaders, but as a new tribe, negotiating a place for itself in the diplomatic webs of native North America. In those webs, the Indians negotiated from a position of strength. France's efforts at colonialism centered on the lucrative fur trade and finding water routes to export that fur from North America to Europe, as well as the global spread of Catholicism. To quote Alan Taylor, in 1534, Jacques Cartier found Micmac waving furs on sticks as an invitation to land and trade. Offering high value per volume, furs were an ideal colonial commodity, one that, like gold and silver, could more than pay for its transatlantic transportation. Rendered scarce in Europe by overhunting, furs commanded high prices for making hats and trimming fine clothes. Because Indians voluntarily performed the hard work of hunting the animals and treating their furs, traders could immediately profit in America without the time, trouble, expense, and violence of conquering Indians to reorganize their labor in mines and plantations. French officials tried to limit the fur trade to the forts, but a growing number of young, independent traders known as coureurs de bois paddled their canoes far beyond the posts to trade with the natives at their own villages. From the natives, the coureurs de bois learned the patterns of the rivers and seasons, the rudiments of Indian languages, and the native ways of trade, war, and love. Alone or in small groups, these traders ventured into a dangerous world, where even native allies sometimes killed to steal their goods, to keep weapons from reaching their enemies, to avenge a previous killing by another Frenchman, or to satisfy a drunken rage. In 1684 alone, 39 French traders died at the hands of their allies. A trader lived longer and did more business if he entered a partnership with an Indian woman and obtained her kin network, which provided the best security in the native world. She was also the best teacher of native ways and languages, and a helpmate in the labors of the fur trade, as well as a source of friendship. Owing to war losses, Indian men had become relatively scarce, and the coureurs de bois offered their wives and Indian kin privileged access to the coveted trade goods of Europe. The officials of church and state regarded the coureurs de bois with profound ambivalence. On one hand, they were disreputable and insubordinate people who traded brandy, slept with native women, and evaded oversight by priest and seigneur. In 1680, coureurs de bois employed in Illinois by Sieur de La Salle ran away, demolished his fort, stole his good, and left a graffito, "Nous sommes tous savages." We are all savages. Their contact with the natives rendered the coureurs de bois essential sources of information and conduits for influence. In sum, they simultaneously represented and blurred the power of empire projected far from Quebec. After failing to recall the coureurs de bois, the colonial authorities had to make the best of them. English colonization efforts attracted a large number of male and female British migrants, all of whom sought social mobility, economic prosperity, religious freedom, and improved living conditions. These colonists focused on agriculture and settled on land taken from Native Americans, from whom they lived separately. The first documented English contact with the New World took place in 1497 when John Cabot, Genoese like Christopher Columbus, was employed by the British king to find a route to Asia. He instead rediscovered what he called Newfoundland, ignorant of the previous Vikings' discovery of Vinland. No serious efforts to establish colonies in North America took place until the 17th century. Motivations to expand, which we will talk about in depth in the following slides, included internal issues: land enclosure, increasing poverty and related crime, economic stagnation in the garment industry, wage loss and increasing prices depressed real income, as well as economic prospects, which include an outlet for the growing number of poor, a market for English manufacturers, and relief to the depressed cloth industry. Promoters of colonization in England, known as West Country men because of their promotion of westward movement towards Ireland and beyond, regarded colonial trade as the key to imperial power. Sir Walter Raleigh preached, "He that commands the sea commands the trade, and he that is lord of the trade of the world is lord of the wealth of the world." Richard Hakluyt, the publicist of the West Country men, summarized their goals. Number 1, to plant Christian religion, 2, to traffic, and 3, to conquer. In 16th century England, most of the wealth was concentrated within the top 5% of society. Below them lived 95% of the population. That 95% included some wealthy urban merchants and a far more numerous amount of the middling sort, a mix of farmers, artisans, and shopkeepers. Most commoners, however, belonged to the lower sort, a combination of the working poor and beggars without work. Although extraordinarily open and libertarian when compared to the developing monarchies of Europe, only about 25% of the adult men owned enough property to qualify to vote. Women were disenfranchised. During the later 16th century, economic growth failed to keep pace with a population that grew from 3 million in 1500 to 5 million in 1650. At the same time, trade in cloth, the kingdom's leading manufacturing sector, stagnated. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the enclosure movement fenced in large tracts of land and fenced out most of their former inhabitants. Sheep, hired laborers, and a few tenants replaced a larger number of peasants. Common lands, formerly used to pasture livestock, gather fuel, herbs, roots, fish, and rabbits were also enclosed. The enclosure movement rendered thousands of peasants and laborers redundant, homeless, and miserable. Probably half the rural peasantry lost their lands between 1530 and 1630. Enclosure brought the rural poor to London, whose population grew from 120,000 in 1550 to 375,000 in 1650. Growing unemployment reduced wages that employees had to pay because of the increased pool of available labor, and increased the cost of food and housing because of the increased pool of potential tenants. Real wages were cut in half between 1500 and 1650. Real wages is what your income can actually purchase for you. Increasing crime, poverty, and vagrancy alarmed the property and squeezed the middling class, who were strained by the tax burden of assisting the poor. Promoters of colonization of Virginia, the West Country men, announced it as a place that the poor could be put to work in raising commodities to sell in England. Colonies could improve England's balance of trade with other nations and create a new market to provide relief to the depressed cloth industry. Colonization could simultaneously control and employ the poor while generating new wealth and power for the nation. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh, one of the West Country promoters, sent about 100 colonists, all of them men, to settle Roanoke. Located in present-day North Carolina and situated by dangerous shoals and long sandbanks, the location protected the colonists from Spanish attack, but virtually doomed them to failure, as it made it difficult for English ships to land supplies or load commodities. The sandy soil produced few crops. The colonists expected to be fed by the local Algonquin and found them hospitable. As the English persisted and Algonquin supplies of maize ran low, the Native American chief refused, only to be killed along with his deputy chiefs. Terrified and fleeing Indians eliminated the prospect of their growing more crops to feed the colonists, and the starving colonists gladly abandoned Roanoke later that spring. Planning to relocate the colony to the more hospitable Chesapeake Bay, in 1587, Raleigh sent 94 additional colonists, which included 17 women and 9 children. However, the impatient mariners dumped the colonists again at Roanoke before hurrying on to attack Spanish ships in the Caribbean. John White, the leader of the expedition, had to return home to England in 1589, and when he returned to Roanoke in 1590, he found the colony abandoned with no signs of attack by the Indians or Spanish, only a lone clue, the word Croatoan, the name of a nearby island, was left, carved into a tree. After retreating to Croatoan and failing to contact a passing ship, the colonists probably headed to Chesapeake Bay, where they lived as refugees in a native village. Unfortunately, they ran afoul of Powhatan, and all the refugees were killed. The cultivation of tobacco and its export led to eventual prosperity in the Chesapeake and North Carolina. In 1606, the Virginia Company, a joint stock company, was granted a license from King James I to fund a colony in Virginia. Located on the James River in the Chesapeake Bay, which offered better harbors than Roanoke, the land was fertile, an environmental meeting place of tidewater estuaries and freshwater rivers that abounded in fish, shellfish, edible plants, and game animals. The colonists preferred to mine formica, a local stone, rather than grow corn, which was found to be worthless upon arrival and examination in England. Many colonists never recovered from the demoralizing shock of the misconceptions about an easy life in Jamestown. Unable to cultivate enough corn, they starved during the winter and spring. It is no coincidence that the starving time of 1609 came after colonists forced John Smith, who ordered them to plant 6 hours a day, out of the colony. Jamestown also lay next to a broad swamp, and in the summer bred mosquitoes which carried malaria. The shallow wells were contaminated by brackish water, a mix of fresh and salt water, exposing inhabitants to salt poisoning. The waters also retained the garbage and excrement generated by the colonists, promoting dysentery and typhoid fever. Salt poisoning and disease killed many and often rendered the rest too weak to work. The colony almost failed, but John Rolfe discovered a way to make money: tobacco. In the 1610s, a headright system was instituted, which gave colonists 50 acres of land to men who could pay for their own and the passage of others across the Atlantic. Servants who survived their servitude were also entitled to 50 acres. Private property owners showed much more incentive in cultivating the corn, squash, and beans that ensured their existence. Led by John Rolfe, the planters learned how to raise tobacco in 1616. Virginia's tobacco production surged from 200,000 pounds in 1624 to 3 million in 1638. During the 1620s, tobacco sold in England for about 5 to 10 times what it cost to produce in the Chesapeake. From only 350 people in 1616, population surged to about 13,000 by 1650, and as population increased, far-ranging cattle and pigs devastated Indian cornfields. Increased immigration drove this increase. The mortality rate remained at about 25% until mid-century. There were 3 colonial regions in English North America. The northern colonies included Massachusetts and Plymouth, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The middle colonies included New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and later Delaware, and the southern colonies included Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and later Georgia. The New England colonies, initially settled by Puritans, developed around small towns with family farms and achieved a thriving mixed economy of agriculture and commerce. The climate of New England does not make it suitable for large-scale agriculture, but the region is rich in timber and waterways, which makes it suitable for fishing. The northern colonies include Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Their geography and climate include a rocky soil, immense forests, a cooler climate, and numerous water routes. The pictures on the bottom right-hand side of the screen are all pictures from my wife's parents' property. Barb was born and raised in Maine, and so those pictures from left to right are of the forest, the ocean on the top right, and her parents' home on the bottom left and right in the winter. Too much work and too few colonists, plus the fact that most New England farmers had to rely on their own families for the labor to build their especially demanding farms, kept New England more egalitarian in the distribution of property and power than was the case in the richer Chesapeake, where an elite of great planters exploited the labor of servants and slaves. Plymouth Colony, the first New England settlement, was settled by Puritans in 1620. Puritans were religious separatists who wanted to purify the Church of England from the inside. Though Puritans were economically of the middling sort of English society, which, considering failing harvests, soaring food prices, and famine that killed many poor people in the late 1620s, a deepening depression of the cloth industry, increasing crime, and escalating taxes gave them an economic incentive to leave, it would have been easier to move to the booming Netherlands. Those who emigrated to New England did so over their dread over a worsening state of the Church of England, and they interpreted England's economic woes as divine affliction meant to punish a guilty land that was wallowed in sin. In New England, the Puritans could purify their churches, supervise one another, and enact a code of laws derived from the Bible. At a minimum, withdrawal across the Atlantic might save the godly from the divine punishments gathering against the wicked English nation. In November 1620, the Mayflower Compact, the first contract of government in the New World, established rule through the consent of the governed. Laws would be established for the general good, a legal assembly was created, and a governor elected. The first Puritans, subsequently known as Pilgrims, were beneficiaries of a devastating epidemic that had recently decimated coastal Indians. The Plymouth colonists occupied an abandoned village with conveniently cleared fields. In 1620-21, a hard winter killed half of the newcomers, but more immigrants and good crops stabilized the colony. By 1630, about 1,500 English lived in Plymouth Colony. The following are two stories about their voyage to the New World. Francis Higginson recalled one sore and terrible storm, for the wind blew mightily, the rain fell vehemently, the sea roared, and the waves tossed us horribly. Besides, it was fearful dark, and the mariners was afraid. William Bradford recalled that upon reaching New England, the Plymouth colonists fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. Their God was remarkably merciful. During the 1630s, of 198 recorded voyages bearing passengers to New England, only one sank, and the mortality from disease was less than 5%. The Massachusetts Bay Colony began under the leadership of John Winthrop, a lawyer who represented a syndicate of wealthy Puritans who obtained a royal charter as the Massachusetts Bay Company. The leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Company quickly relocated themselves, their capital, charter, and records to New England. In effect, they converted their commercial charter into a self-governing colony 3,000 miles from bishops of the Church of England or king. They established a theocratic republic where the Puritan men elected their governor, deputy governor, and legislature, the most radical government in the European world. For some, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was not a place of tolerance. For others, it was too tolerant. Some particularly ambitious Puritans found Massachusetts too lax in religion and founded the colonies of Connecticut and New Haven. Rhode Island existed as a safety valve for discontents who may fester in the midst of Massachusetts or Connecticut. The unique theological diversity of Rhode Island attracted Baptists, Quakers, and Jews. Rhode Islanders also sought a separation of church and state from a conviction that any mingling corrupted religion. Anne Hutchinson, claiming the power of prophecy, led prayer meetings in her Boston home, attracting hundreds of followers. She suggested that most of the ministers and magistrates of the colony were godless hypocrites. Considering her a threat to the social order, the leaders of Massachusetts expelled Hutchinson and she took refuge in Rhode Island. The New England colonies were virtually independent of Crown authority. Answering to no external proprietors, the New England colonies developed republican regimes where the propertied men elected their governors and councils, as well as their assemblies, and where much decision-making was dispersed to the many small towns. The New England economy was diverse, including the fishing trade, which was helped by the English Civil War of the 1640s. In 1641, the New English caught 600,000 pounds of fish, which grew to 6 million pounds by 1675. New England fisheries employed 440 boats and more than 1,000 men. Wheat, rye, oats, peas, barley, beef, pork, fish, butter, cheese, timber, mast, tar, soap, plankboard, frames of houses, clapboard, and pipe staves all proved staple commodities. Between 1674 and 1714, New Englanders built more than 1,200 ships. By 1700, Boston alone had 15 shipyards, ranking second only to London as a shipbuilding center in the empire. New Englanders maintained their divine mission to create a model society in America, a Bible commonwealth dedicated to the worship of God and to the rules of a godly society. Puritan authorities punished or exiled those who seemed bent on the devil's work of destroying New England: sinners, dissidents, and witches. By design, New England lacked church courts and tithes, bishops and archbishops, church weddings and ales, Sunday sports, and Christmas. Puritans promoted a reformed church culture that emphasized literacy and lay participation in governing congregations. Every New England town sustained a public grammar school, and most women and almost all men could read. This was not the case in England or any other colonial region. Book ownership in New England was more widespread than anywhere else in the world. Literate New Englanders were demanding participants in their churches and culture, often challenging and criticizing their ministers. By law, every town had to sustain a church supported by taxes levied on all households, whether the members of that household were a member of the church or not. The average New Englander heard about 7,000 sermons over the course of their lifetime. In 1636, Massachusetts founded Harvard College to train an Orthodox Puritan ministry for the many churches. In 1640, a printing press was opened in Cambridge. New Englanders wanted a uniform society with no room for toleration. In Massachusetts and Connecticut, 4 Quakers were executed between 1659 and 1661. The picture on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide is a printing press from the 1700s. New England was a northern and hilly land with a short growing season and faster flowing rivers and streams, which discouraged the malaria and dysentery that afflicted southern planters. New Englanders who survived childhood could expect to live to be about 70. In the Chesapeake, only a minority survived beyond 45. This healthier, longer-lived, and more sex-balanced population sustained a rapid growth through natural increase. New England received only 21,000 immigrants, yet by 1700, New England's colonial population was 91,000. The Middle Colonies, called as such because they lay between the New England and Chesapeake colonies, included New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and later Delaware. Their geography and environment includes mild climate, rich soils, hilly and flat lands. In 1664, the English conquered the mid-Atlantic seaboard. That conquest absorbed a medley of non-English peoples, including Dutch, Swedes, Finns, Walloons, Flemings, Huguenots, Germans, and Norwegians. This diversity contrasted with the Chesapeake and New England, where almost all of the white colonists came from England. The Middle Colonies defined a distinctive culture and social order that anticipated the American future. Exploring the area that came to be New Netherland as early as 1609, The town of New Amsterdam was fortified in 1625 as a fur trading outpost for trading with the Iroquois. New Netherland became the most religiously and ethnically mixed colony in North America. The Dutch were a minority in their own colony. 20% of the population were Puritan dissidents, which would be problematic in 1664 when the English sent an expedition to conquer New Netherlands for 5 reasons. Number 1, to eliminate New Amsterdam as a base for Dutch trading with Virginia, which violated the Navigation Acts. Second, to capture the valuable Upper Hudson fur trade. Third, to intimidate the New England colonies. Fourth, to erase the obstruction between New England and the Chesapeake and connect the British colonies geographically. Fifth, to reward his younger brother James with a proprietary colony. English common law limited the rights of Dutch colonial women to hold, manage, or dispose of property, and they became legally covered by their husband's identity under an English concept called coverture. Parents began to reserve real estate inheritance for sons, and the widow's share, what a widow received after her husband would have passed away, dropped from the Dutch half to the English third. Not until the mid-18th century did most Dutch begin to adopt English languages and customs. To cancel a debt of £16,000 owed to Admiral William Penn, King Charles II granted Penn's son, also William Penn, 45,000 acres as the colony of Pennsylvania. Penn had converted to Quakerism, then an especially radical, persecuted form of Protestantism. Penn's wealth made him an unusual Quaker, most of whom were tradesmen, shopkeepers, and small farmers, distrustful of wealth and state power. In turn, the rich generally despised the Quakers. Quakers wore plain clothes, refused to take oaths of allegiance or for testimony, used plain, familiar language with all people, established parallel men's and women's leadership for their meetings, refused to bear arms, and sought the amelioration of or abolition of slavery. Pennsylvania was an ideal market for family farmers producing grains and livestock for transatlantic market and for merchants exporting that produce. The Delaware River offered cheap and easy transportation from farms to Philadelphia. In contrast to New England, southeastern Pennsylvania possessed fertile soil and an easily tilled landscape of low, rolling hills. The relatively long growing season of 180 days offered greater certainty that grains would ripen before a killing autumn frost. Family farms worked primarily by free labor prevailed, which meant a relatively egalitarian distribution of wealth. Warmer than New England, the climate was healthier and more temperate than the Chesapeake. Learning from the mistakes of the Chesapeake, the Pennsylvanians avoided the golden delusions and starving times that afflicted their predecessors. Pennsylvania also enjoyed prolonged peace with the local Indians, avoiding the sort of native rebellion that had devastated Virginia, New England, and New Netherland, as well as Spanish New Mexico. Better soil, bigger farms, and a longer growing season enabled Pennsylvania's farmers to produce larger crops and herds at a lower cost. The most valuable grain for export, wheat, thrived in Pennsylvania at the same time that it withered in New England from a destructive blight. During the 18th century, economic growth raised the standard of living in Pennsylvania above that in New England. Family farms prevailed, and the rural prosperity was broad-based, with few landless and fewer rich. The southern colonies included Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Their geography and environment included a very warm climate, large coastal plains, and highly fertile soil. The colonies of the southern Atlantic coast and the British West Indies used long growing seasons to develop plantation economies based on exporting staple crops, such as tobacco and later cotton. They depended on the labor of first indentured servants and later enslaved Africans, who often constituted the majority of the population in these areas, and developed their own forms of cultural and religious autonomy. At the top of the social order in Virginia and Maryland were hard-driving merchants and planters who were competitive, ruthless, callous, and insecure. These men had not been at the top or were not born into the highest classes of British society. As long as prosperity prevailed, however, and it did during a tobacco boom of the 1630s and 40s, colonists accepted these men as their leaders. Assemblies of local magnates, large landowners, were more oligarchical than democratic. The American interdependence of elite rule, popular politics, and white racial supremacy developed together in colonial Virginia. Power was restricted to the landed and denied to indentured servants, landless freedmen, and women. The prevalence of single men in Virginia, who made up 74% of the population, increased social volatility. Only 10% of the population were women. Although slavery was not economically feasible till the late 1600s, the first African slaves were imported in 1619. The Chesapeake was a place where few newcomers, black or white, survived more than 5 years. In 1650, enslaved Africans numbered only 2% of the population. Masters of indentured servants, the preferred labor of agriculture at the time, readily resorted to the whip. Servants were fundamentally property, sometimes sold to settle gambling debts. Defiant servants had their servitude extended, dependent on the length of their absence. William Berkeley governed Virginia for most of the years between 1641 and 1676. Berkeley was an elitist, and his quote about education shows his attitude about the social order. "I thank God there are no free schools nor printing in Virginia, and I hope we shall not have these for 100 years, for learning has brought disobedience and heresy." Although most immigrants mortgaged 4 years of labor to pay for a 6-pound transatlantic voyage, Berkeley collected an annual salary of 1,000 pounds. A small planter was fortunate to clear 3 pounds annually. Because Berkeley granted the best public lands and large tracts to his favorites, freedmen could rarely obtain their own farms, and after 1665, most had to rent at a rate of 10 to 25% of their crop. The inability to purchase lands led to freedmen moving westward and encroaching on native lands. Westward movement led to war in 1675, and settlers demanded permission to exterminate frontier natives. Berkeley, who understood that controlled expansion better served the interests of the wealthiest planters, who wanted to retain the men as laborers and tenants, refused. When Berkeley insisted on constructing 9 frontier forts, the colonists found a leader in Nathaniel Bacon, a charismatic and recently immigrated wealthy planter who was also Berkeley's cousin by marriage. Bacon's indiscriminate attacks led to the killings of mostly local Algonquin trading partners of the colonists, rather than the Susquehannock, with whom the colonists were at war, but more easily escaped into the forests. Bacon recruited common planters and servants by promising immediate freedom to those who deserted Berkeley to join the rebellion. Bacon's men drove the governor out of Jamestown and burned it to the ground, but suddenly Bacon died of dysentery and the movement lost its leader. Berkeley returned and hanged 23 rebel leaders. Free immigrants, although a minority, dominated economic and political life, becoming the councilors, assemblymen, and justices. Statistics show that poor English became better able to clothe, feed, and house themselves in the 1680s and decided more often against colonial immigration. During the 1660s, the average York County household had 2 servants. By the 1690s, the average was 2 servants per 10 households. Increasingly, planters turned to African slaves. 25 to 30 pounds for a lifetime of labor compared well with 15 pounds for 4 years of servitude. The number of enslaved surged from 300 in 1650 to 150,000 in 1750. Compared to their Massachusetts counterparts, Virginia assemblymen received about 5 times in pay per day in session, 150 pounds in tobacco. Chesapeake democracy was concentrated in the hands of the few. New Englanders developed republican regimes in which propertied men elected governors and councils, as well as assemblies, and decision-making was dispersed to the small towns. Salutary neglect allowed the colonial legislatures to control taxation, and the Navigation Acts generally failed or were avoided. Mercantilism is governed by the principle that the government should shape the economy to serve its needs for more revenue, ships, and men for use in war, and to drive other nations out of overseas markets. Mercantilism assumes a chronic state of war and considers all other nations as competing for the same limited quantity of trade. The 3 Navigation Acts were passed with the idea of mercantilism in mind and had 3 fundamental principles. 1. Only English ships could trade with any English colony. 2. A few enumerated commodities that yielded the highest profit or tax revenue, such as tobacco and sugar, could only be shipped to England. Colonial ships were free to take all other produce where they wanted. And 3. All European goods had to pass through an English port where they paid customs duties. Colonists routinely ignored imperial regulations that hurt their economic interests. British slave traders, which reached the top of the transatlantic slave trade in the 18th century, carried 2.5 million enslaved Africans to the Americas, participated in the triangular trade, which included the notorious Middle Passage. Statistically, the consequences of trading with European colonizers for Native Americans were dire. From a population of 300,000 in 1492, the Taino of Hispaniola were 500 by 1548. European smallpox and measles epidemics killed half of the Iroquois between 1633 and 1635. Smallpox floats through the air on moisture droplets or dust particles to enter the lungs. After incubating for 12 days, the victim comes down with a high fever and vomiting, followed by 3 to 4 days with gruesome sores over their entire bodies. In 1700, Indians in South Carolina numbered 15,000. By 1730, their population declined to 4,000. Interaction between European arrivals and Native American populations fostered accommodation and conflict. Native Americans had grown dependent on the steel tools, guns, and alcohol the Europeans traded in exchange for furs. Demoralizing disease epidemics led some Native Americans to adopt Christianity, but in the 17th and 18th centuries, Native American-European conflict was the norm, evidenced by the Pequot War, King Philip's War, and the French and Indian War. The pattern of violence against and confiscation from Native Americans in this period is evident. Colonists expressed dissatisfaction over issues including territorial settlements, frontier defense, self-rule, and trade. England's increasing economic and military power relative to its European counterparts meant that some colonies transitioned from proprietary to royal, from local control to an appointed governor, which increased corruption and decreased democracy. Although the Navigation Acts were passed to ensure adherence to the mercantile system, British Customs Service collected less than £2,000, though more than 700,000 pounds of commerce were being smuggled in. All of the following illustrate how conflicts over land, resources, and political boundaries led to military confrontation. King Philip's War in New England was fought over the westward expansion of British colonies. The Paxton Boys were a group of Scots-Irish Pennsylvania frontiersmen who retaliated against Native Americans at the end of the French and Indian War. The Pueblo Revolt drove the Spanish out of Santa Fe for 12 years, and upon Spanish return, they stopped forced assimilation. Jonathan Edwards, a Congregationalist minister, and George Whitefield, an Anglican, led an 18th century religious revival that swept across the 13 colonies. Whitefield's sensational preaching was seen by crowds as large as 20,000, larger than the population of Boston. During his 14-month stay in America, Items featuring Whitefield appeared in 3/4 of the issues of Ben Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette. The awakening created church divisions between old lights, those who didn't believe in the less rational aspects such as weeping, fainting, crying out, and dramatic preaching, and new lights that did. The awakening led to the creation of Princeton, Brown, Yale, and Rutgers universities. The Church of England became the religious standard in most colonies, along with representative assembly and royal governors. All colonies spoke English as the main language. Northern merchants and southern planters all modeled their lives on upper-class British, from houses to clothing to gilded carriages to education of their sons and to reading of music. Currency was largely dependent on warehouse receipts, bills of exchange, and promissory notes. All colonies were bound by the mercantile system. Enlightenment ideals such as the right to life, liberty, and property spread to the colonies and would be the backbone of the coming revolution. Although the British government attempted to incorporate the colonies from proprietary to royal, enforcement of the Navigation Acts was lax at best. The Puritans saw the Church of England as extremely corrupt and created a system of self-government almost completely independent of royal authority. The 13 colonies were a place where many religions, including Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, were practiced along with atheism. The planter class controlled the salary of Anglican ministers in the Chesapeake, making it unlikely that ministers would speak against the ills of society. Colonial assemblies controlled royal governors by controlling their salaries. Annually appropriated salaries gave the assembly power to withhold from an uncooperative governor. Most governors concluded the best way to get along was to go along. Enlightenment ideals that held the universe obeyed predictable natural laws, such as a person's right to life, liberty, and property, rather than the dictates of God, led colonists to believe they were the font of democracy and encouraged anti-authoritarianism. For example, a monarch believed that they were placed in their position by God, but the colonists, who subscribed to the Enlightenment, believed that if a monarch violated their natural rights, that monarch should be overthrown. Eventually, these ideals would erode British authority in North America, but the colonists still thought of themselves as Englishmen, happy to be a part of the British Empire. Although family farming in the northeastern colonies led to a more equal distribution of wealth, slavery existed in every colony. The population of enslaved in New England was less than 2%. Seaport colonies, including New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, all participated in the slave trade through the providing of food to the West Indies, buying molasses to make rum, or by transporting slaves from Africa. The West Indies drew 78% of the enslaved, but slavery existed as well in the Chesapeake, South Carolina, and Georgia, who made the argument that their liberties were restricted by the fact that from 1733 to 51, Georgia had been without slavery. The following information applies specifically to Virginia, but broadly to the Carolinas and later Georgia. One distinction is that the white colonists that populated South Carolina and Georgia came from the West Indies and brought rice and indigo farming to Carolina and Georgia. All of the information that's included on this slide is not included on the outline. Planters, fearful of the growing number of African slaves who brought their language and culture with them, demanded new laws restricting their movement and trading. No more than 4 enslaved could assemble beyond their plantation. None could leave without a written pass from the master. Militia squads patrolled the roads and inspected slave quarters to search for weapons, and courts fined lax planters who allowed their enslaved to roam. Saturday became a full workday, and masters virtually abolished manumission from a resolve to retain all of their enslaved for life. Chronic runaways had their toes chopped off or suffered castration. Colonial authorities held no master liable for the death of his slave from excessive punishment. Legislation promoted solidarity by all whites across their class lines. Laws invited poor whites to bully enslaved with impunity, creating a common sense of superiority among whites. Free blacks lost rights, including the right to bear arms, hold office, vote, or employ white servants. They paid higher taxes and had stricter penalties imposed on them for committing the same crimes, all while having to worry about being kidnapped by slave traders. Skin color became the key marker of identity and obscured class distinction between common planters and great planters. Enslaved Africans resisted their enslavement in ways that were covert and overt. Covert resistance included the breaking of implements or purposefully working slow. Overt resistance would have terrible consequences for the enslaved Africans and for local whites. In September 1739, the Stono Rebellion began when 20 enslaved stole guns and gunpowder from a store, decapitating the two storekeepers. As they marched south towards Spanish Florida, their numbers grew to 80. Along the way, they burned 7 plantations, killing 20 whites, beating drums and chanting liberty. The local militia mounted forces and killed most of the rebels, usually after they had surrendered. They cut off their heads, placing them on posts, one every mile between the battlefield and Charlestown. 30 escaped into the forest, but within a month almost all were killed by a massive manhunt that included Indian bounty hunters.